Thank you, Chairwoman Capito, for convening this hearing. I appreciate the opportunity we have on the subcommittee to examine a very wide, diverse range of interests across many agencies, and in particular, the Department of Treasury. And I look forward to finding common ground and strengthening our partnership. And I'd like to welcome our witnesses, Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, Commissioner John Koskinen, and Inspector General Russell George. Thank you for joining us this morning and for your service to our nation. Today we're considering the budget request by the Treasury Department, a department that is central to our government stability and operations, that helps sustain our country's fiscal health and protect our national security, from collecting taxes and processing over $3 trillion in federal payments to pursuing financial crimes here in the United States and identifying individuals here and abroad that would promote terror. I am concerned the budget request we're considering would undermine the department's ability to fulfill all these critical roles. In the non-IRS parts of Treasury, the budget requests $1.3 billion, 26% less than current levels. And to achieve that reduction, the budget would rely on staff cuts achieved through department-wide hiring freeze. My concern is that this might not result in a strategic realignment of resources, but instead drain the department's best and brightest to meet an arbitrary budget goal. The budget also cuts some common sense investments like cybersecurity improvements and upgrades to financial systems that I think the entire federal government relies on for Treasury services. I'm also concerned about proposed cuts to the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, which helps enforce economic sanctions, and reductions in the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which combats domestic and international money laundering. I think these are all areas of your department worthy of full investment. I have continually called upon this administration and its predecessor to crack down on Iran and North Korea and other regimes that support terror. And although there have been some mixed signals, I believe the administration shares and strongly supports these goals. And I'd be interested in hearing whether the requested funding levels are sufficient for these vital bureaus. The budget also proposes to eliminate grants to CDFIs, to community development financial institutions, which support development and create jobs in underserved neighborhoods around our country. And cuts funds for entities created in the wake of the financial crisis, an 8% cut for FSOC, a Financial Stability Oversight Council, and 25% to the Office of Financial Research, both of which I think have real value. But let's look at the majority of the budget before us, which is the IRS. No government agency is more visible, more impactful to the American people than the Internal Revenue Service, which collects the revenues that fund more than 95% of the federal government's operations and public service. And each year, more than 80,000 public servants at the IRS make hundreds of millions of contacts with American taxpayers. There have been 7 consecutive years of either budget freezes or budget cuts to IRS. The proposal we're reviewing today would continue that trend by cutting, I think, $260 million from an under-resourced agency. And my concerns aren't based on the partisan politics of this. To put the scale of this proposed cut in context, President Trump's level for the IRS falls $400 million short of what President Bush asked for in 2009. And I think the predictable impact of this reduction would be the loss of more than 4,000 staff in taxpayer services, which would significantly diminish the services for taxpayers seeking pre-filing and post-filing guidance in order to timely and accurately meet their tax obligations. The level of service in the upcoming year, if this cut is enacted, would drop to nearly 40%, 45% during peak filing. That would mean more than 6 out of 10 callers, that more than 6 of 10 callers will not be helped on toll-free lines as they seek guidance. My office hears from Delawareans frustrated when their calls to IRS go unanswered or when it takes a long time to connect with an IRS official. I imagine many other Senate offices hear from constituents with similar concerns, and I think the solution is to give the agency the resources to meet these constituent needs. So I look forward to hearing more about why the department and the IRS think it's a good idea to reduce service delivery rates and what we might do together to address that. We have a lot more to discuss today. Let me just move to the end and say, in the absence of a funding agreement on our committee, we will continue to work here. I'm grateful for your service and look forward to your testimony. And I know that our respective constituents expect no less than a highly efficient and well-functioning IRS and Department of the Treasury, and I look forward to working with you, Chairwoman Capito, as we move forward in our 2018 process. Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Capito. I'd just like to ask unanimous consent that a written statement submitted by Anthony Reardon, President of the National Treasury Employees Union, be included in the record.
without objection.
Thank you. Secretary Mnuchin, thanks for our conversation before this hearing and for your service. I just wanted to ask 5 questions quickly, if I might. First, just there's been some concern that the administration is directing cabinet secretaries to not respond to requests from the minority party, despite a longstanding tradition upheld by both parties. Will you commit to responding to questions from both the majority and minority?
I will, and I believe we've been responsive to that already, but we will continue to do so.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I wanted to talk about the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the TFTC that you mentioned in your opening remarks. I view these as highly valuable. As we spoke about, I think enforcing sanctions is a critical role that your department plays, but the budget proposes modest but reductions in these funding of these agencies. Do you think this budget provides sufficient funding for these 2 bureaus given their vital missions and given that there's other places, we talked about South Sudan, but there's places in the world where you're not currently prioritizing them because there's so many others, whether it's North Korea or Russia or sanctions that are currently being enforced against a whole range of other nations. Do you think you've asked for sufficient funding for these 2 bureaus?
Well, let me first comment. I very much believe in the sanctions authorities and what we do within the Treasury, and I'm probably spending 50% of my time on this area because it is so important and so critical to what we're doing. When we submitted the budget, and again, we had to manage the president's priority, which was additional money for military and look for cuts where appropriate. When we did that, the intent was to keep TFI flat. I think actually it went down slightly because we got a little bit more money this year than we had expected at the time. So the intent was to keep it flat, was not to reduce it. Now, I might add, as I mentioned to you when we had the opportunity to meet, since we've submitted the budget, we do have other requirements. One of them, as I mentioned, is the Terrorist Financing Center, where we are seeking additional funds for that. I think it's a very, very important investment over the next 10 years and very effective, and this is something that Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis fully support.
Well, thank you. I look forward to exploring that further, but I think we have a shared enthusiasm for vigorous sanctions enforcement in partnership with our allies, both here and in other parts of the world. Let me move to the Community Development Financial Institutions, CDFIs. The fund that supports them has strong bipartisan support because CDFIs have a record of creating jobs in underserved communities. They leverage federal funds roughly 12 to 1 in the last oversight analysis, investing about $3 billion a year. That's why last year's appropriations bill increased their funding 6%. But the FY18 budget proposes to eliminate them. Would you commit to following congressional intent and fully utilizing all the funds that we provided in the FY17 appropriations? And help me understand why you would eliminate a program with a proven record of economic growth. Was this making tough choices in the context of a difficult budget environment, or do you think they actually should not be funded?
Oh, this was, as I mentioned, in the context of making difficult choices. So I do agree that CDFIs have played an important role in the community. This was merely a function of us making difficult decisions across. Now, the one thing I would also add, that when we came out with our recommendation on financial reforms, one of the areas that I recommended that we look at is the Community Reinvestment Act. So one of the things we want to make sure is, as banks are dedicating significant money under the CRA, that it's being used appropriately. And we want to make sure we meet with community groups and advocates because that's a big area of investment that we think can be more effective.
2 quick questions, if I might, Mr. Secretary. Well, first, I want to make sure you've answered the question. Will you commit to follow congressional intent on the funded? Thank you. There's also a proposed cut to the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, an area actually strongly supported by industry because it helps them get their products to market faster. Are you concerned that those budget cuts would reverse an area where the industry actually supports more action by the Treasury Department?
Well, again, let me just emphasize, I have personally met with that group. I think they perform a very important function. It's actually quite effective what they do. They manage it under a very reasonable budget. And again, we've scaled back their budget slightly. This is in no way intended to signal that it's not important. It is, quite frankly, very important what they do.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. As we spoke about, the U.S. reached the debt limit in March, and you're using extraordinary measures to avoid default. Do you agree allowing the government to default on its debts is a terrible idea that would have significant consequences for our market and economy, and even the threat of default has the potential for costly implications for the government and undermines our credibility?
Senator, yes, thank you for asking that question, which is on one of my favorite subjects and has also been one of the previous secretary's favorite subjects. So let me again emphasize that the United States credit is of utmost importance. We are the reserve currency, and we must pay our bills on time. So as I have suggested in the past, based upon our best estimate at the time, we do have funding through September, but I have urged Congress to take this up before they leave for the recess.
I appreciate your leadership on that. And I'll ask one last question, if I might, or should I?
You're the ranking member. I'm the fill-in chairwoman.
You're the fill-in chairwoman for the moment. I'll ask one last question about level of service for the IRS. As you heard in my opening remarks, I'm concerned that the cuts proposed to the IRS would reduce service levels. Do you think it's acceptable to provide a level of service where more than 4 out of 10 callers won't connect to an account representative as they're trying to meet their legal obligations to pay their taxes?
So let me just comment on that. And first of all, I think, as you know, tax reform is a major focus of ours. On the personal side, our objective is to simplify tax reform, cut it down the number of brackets. Under our proposed plan, 95% of Americans will be able to fill out their taxes on a simple postcard. So while I agree with you the service levels are an issue, my view, the solution is twofold. One is let's simplify our tax system so not as many people need to call. And two, how do we use technology more effectively as opposed to having used call centers? How can we communicate with the taxpayers electronically?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.